All right, welcome everybody to a special edition of Take the Black Live. We are here with Leigh Bardugo, author and creator of the Grishaverse, which is soon to be adapted to Netflix as Shadow and Bone, available on April 23rd. So surely going to be Netflix's next big hit. So we're super excited to talk to you today, Leigh. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good. How are you today?
Doing good. Looking forward to our chat. I wanted to start with, I heard this wonderful story that's circulating about how the Shadow and Bone showrunner, Eric Roth, was attached to the project. Apparently he had reached out to you on Twitter just in a complimentary way about your books. And that led Netflix to basically stalk him down and offer him the job. Is that, am I getting that right?
I mean, pretty much. Eric sent me a tweet when he was reading Six of Crows. I believe he actually took a picture of it sitting on his lap on the way to the Academy Awards, which is, quite the flex. Right. And he paid me a compliment. And from his end, it was just, oh, it's one creator reaching out to another. But, my friends and I were like, oh my God, the screenwriter from Arrival just is reading your book. So there was this sort of like, wow, wouldn't it be great if moment. And then when Netflix optioned the Shadow and Bone trilogy, I said to them, Eric Roth, pretty impressive guy, is a fan. Should we see if he's at all interested in doing television? So they did, but from what I understand from Eric, he was like, I only want to do this if I can bring all of the Grishaverse books together. And they were like, well, we don't have the rights to them, so let us call you back.
Right. Well, I mean, and I think everybody's reaction, with his, obviously he wrote Arrival and a lot of other great film and TV projects. So it's definitely exciting to see him be attached to it. But on the flip side, once production started, how involved, obviously he could have said, like you said, he was on the way to the Academy Awards. He could have said, we don't need any help. So how involved, I understand that you were pretty involved. How did that process work?
Look, I think you can ask any author that there's a lot of terror involved in the adaptation process, because we all know horror stories about authors getting locked out of their own work, not being allowed on set, not being allowed to contribute. And I sat down with Eric really early on. It wasn't our first meeting. I think it was actually our second. We went and had breakfast. And I sat down with him and I said, I'm really freaked out. We know what this process looks like for authors. It's particularly bad when it comes to women authors, and it's even worse for women who write young adult. And I said, I'm really afraid that I'm going to be locked out of my own house. And he promised me that wouldn't happen. He said, I swear to you that at the end of this, we are going to be friends. We may not have a show, but we're going to be friends. And to his credit, he may be the only honest man in Hollywood, but he's stuck to that vow and he kept me involved. And when I was frustrated or upset about something, we would talk it out. I did not always get my way. That is not what collaboration is about. But I never felt disrespected by him or his writing team, ever.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always, like you said, it is always a collaborative approach. So you're not always going to get everything you want, but it's definitely great to still be involved no matter what. So
once it's good to get everything you want. Some of the things I wanted, I look back and I'm like, well, maybe that wouldn't have been such a good idea. Sometimes neither of you gets what you want, and the thing that you get is actually better than what both of you were envisioning.
I've heard that as well. So definitely good, at the very least, though, to be a part of the process. So, and once that process began, what was it like for you as the author to see your creations walk onto set, on the screen, to see those things brought to life?
Well, I will be honest with you. I actually have not said this in a single interview, so let's hope that Netflix doesn't descend from the ceiling upon my head. But so we had all the scripts, everything had been approved, we're going ahead, everybody's in Budapest. And before I ever got to do my first set visit, I got to see the dailies. I saw the first set of dailies. And I literally had said, I was at a writing retreat and I said, I don't know how they're going to pull this off. I said, it's going to be terrible. I don't know how they're going to, like, I couldn't fathom the scope of this and what they were going to have to pull together in order to make it happen. And then they sent me the first dailies and I said, well, son of a bitch, they did it. You know, like there was this sudden shock in me. I was like, this looks good. This looks expensive. And the chemistry between the actors was so palpable. And I thought, I know that it was all hard work and incredible people and talent, but I have to believe there was a lightning strike. There was luck involved as well. So for me, that was pretty shocking. And then getting to visit set was a whole other animal. It was incredibly emotional, honestly.
I can only imagine. And I do, it's interesting that you brought up that you thought that you were a little intimidated whether or not they're going to be able to pull it off, because having read the books, I had sort of the same thought, and having seen the show, my reaction was sort of the same, I think, as yours, that it looks wonderful. It looks expensive. It does not look, as I've seen quite a lot of TV and quite a lot of Netflix shows, and they're not all the same. So it could have gone one direction or another. And that was one of the aspects that struck me, was just how expensive and filled in the world looks. So, I
mean, I think you and I both know, I think any fantasy fan knows how wrong, when fantasy goes bad, it goes really bad, because it does take a tremendous amount of money and I think creative vision to bring a secondary world to life. And I remember when they were making Game of Thrones and seeing all the billboards around town. And I remember, and I had not yet been published, but I remember thinking, if this goes badly, no one's going to adapt fantasy for like another 10, 20 years.
Right. Yeah.
So we got lucky.
Yeah. Well, and the Game of Thrones had the opposite effect. Now everything is being adapted because of its success. So, it's interesting how you mentioned as far as bringing it to life, because one of the obviously the major difference from just the Shadow and Bone trilogy is that you guys have melded in the characters from Six of Crows. Mm-hmm. So how early on was that the plan, and what kind of difficulties did that present as far, because the timelines are separate.
Yeah.
So bringing those characters into the show in a meaningful way.
So Eric wanted to do that from moment one. And in our very first meeting, we talked about it. And I loved the idea because I really wanted the world to feel big from moment one. And we understood that if we were lucky enough to continue this story, we needed to introduce these characters early on to make it possible for that to happen. But also, Shadow and Bone is very much a kind of classic Chosen One story. Right. And Six of Crows is not. Six of Crows is a heist story, but it is also about people who don't have grand destinies, royal blood, great magical power. It's about the people who are considered expendable, who are caught in the crossfire. And to me, having those two perspectives in the world from the first moment was much more powerful. And in fact, throws Alina's journey and Ravka's status as this isolated country into much sharper relief. So it felt natural and organic to do that. The big challenge was how we were going to do it. And that was, to me, about, you cannot take book one of Six of Crows and book one of Shadow and Bone and mash them together, because largely because Six of Crows revolves around this drug Jerda Parem, which has these tremendous effects on Grisha power. Once that gets into the mix with the Darkly and Alina, the whole plot blows up. And it brings in an entirely different set of antagonists as well. It becomes a crowded story as opposed to a compelling one. So what we decided early on was we were going to Frankenstein the characters. We weren't going to Frankenstein the plot lines. And I was actually on the phone with Eric and a bunch of other executive producers when he said, well, what if, and came up with the mechanism for the way these two groups were going to be coming into contact. And there was this pause. And then it was like, we were all like, yeah, like that's the thing. Like as soon as he said it, it was so obvious. And I think it's obvious from the trailer. I'm kind of dancing around it to avoid spoilers, but that connection was very clear and felt exactly right. So now we've created a kind of alternate timeline where the characters and their stories remain intact, but where it's not what happens in the Grishaverse, but it's certainly what could have happened. It's I think, a very quality retcon.
Yeah, and I felt like watching it, and again, staying away from spoilers, I did feel like it was a natural way to include it. They didn't feel like they were forced into the story, because obviously in Six of Crows, like you mentioned, they're off doing something completely different. So I was interested to see that before I started watching, and it definitely felt natural and felt like a welcome addition, I thought, to the overall plot. So
I agree.
You also have mentioned, you talked about just a second ago how it gets the narrative can get crowded. I know a couple of major characters like Wyland Van Eck, Prince Nikolai, they're absent from the show, right? And I mean, obviously there's time later on, hopefully, to include them, but was there anybody that maybe on the show that was included, but maybe you wish would have been had a little more screen time, something like that?
I mean, that's a tough one, because there are certain characters who I think it's in the nature of authors and writers to see possibility. Every person sort of becomes a doorway to a different timeline for the story, a different POV. But my hope is that, with characters, particularly characters like Jenya and David, that we'll get to see more of them if we get the second season. I would definitely love to see Sturmhond and Nikolai make their appearance, and there are smaller characters, and Wyland, is so essential to the plot of those books and to the development of those characters. And I think Wyland is also really one of the only genuine teenagers in all of the books. He is the only person who's had a kind of sheltered life and a proper childhood. Everybody else has sort of, been through it. So I think it would be amazing to see him come into play in the second season. But all we can do right now is, cross our fingers and form a prayer circle.
Yeah. Well, we're definitely rooting for it. And then I know you've also speak about how elsewhere you've spoken about how, some of it's kind of a major thing in the first book in Shadow and Bone, that some of the ethnicities of your characters are not explicitly stated, right? And I know obviously for the show they were changed a little bit, or at least fleshed out. That's a pretty major change, but were there any other major changes that you enjoyed, that you look back and you're like, okay, that I can see how that's an improvement on the source material?
I mean, to me, Eric and I, in that first meeting, talked about the fact, and I have talked about this elsewhere, like when I was writing Shadow and Bone, I think it was echoing a lot of the fantasy I grew up in, which is, not bad fantasy, but it is very straight and very white, which is not what my world looks like. And so, as the books progress, they begin to reflect the real world much more, I think, authentically, which I think the show does a better job of. And I said to him, you can do this better than I did. So, and I think that having a character like Alina, who has spent her life being disregarded and disrespected because of the way she looks and her mother's background, becoming the savior of a nation is just makes the story much richer and has a lot of dimension to it. And then for me too, the trilogy is told in first person POV, right? And it's, I've never written anything in first person since then, because it drove me slightly nuts by the end of that. Writing a battle scene in first person was not a great deal of fun. And the other thing it does is it closes you off from the experiences of some of the other characters. So one of the things I loved that the show did is they went and they excavated some of the bonus material I had written, the Jenya short story, the letter from Mal to Alina that was in the Shadow and Bone paperback, the short story Demon in the Wood that focuses on the Darkling's youth. And they took those and they really blew them out and developed them for a better understanding of those characters. And that, I think, is quite meaningful, because Alina's experiences at the palace are much different if you look at them up against the experiences of a soldier who has no magical power, who has a rifle that jams in the worst possible circumstances, who is ill-equipped and underfunded and being sent to die, who is essentially cannon fodder. That juxtaposition, I think, is very powerful and tells you a lot, not just about the world, but about the characters.
Yeah, and I thought it also, I think you've kind of said this as well. I think it also added that reluctance to her when she first kind of discovers her powers, because she doesn't, here's a country that hasn't really treated her super well, like you said. And so, you know, all chosen ones kind of go through a reluctance phase, but hers felt very natural because she had a reason. She had been discarded and she had kind of been looked down upon. So I definitely like the added dimensions of that. So, okay, but now we have to talk about the dirt. What was something on the show that you said, absolutely not, can't happen, can't do that, not my characters? Was there anything like that? Give us the...
I'm not going to be super specific, but there was a costume that I saw the sketches for, and I didn't see a lot of the costumes until they had already been made, and we were on such an incredibly intense, tight schedule. And I need to be clear: I think Wendy Partridge is extraordinary, but this particular costume, there was no way for her to know. But I was like, no, it can't. It just cannot be. And it's the kind of thing that, you know, probably most people would never have noticed or picked up on, but I literally said to Eric, I will go stand in the street outside of Netflix, stopping traffic before I let this happen. So yeah. He's had to put up with a lot from me, let's be honest.
Well, the characters are your babies. They're your creation. So you definitely, if anybody is qualified to, you know, to fight for them, it's you. So
look, there were times when there were particular choices about what a character knew or didn't know at a given time, where I would sort of sit down and say, look, if this person had this knowledge and withheld it, that is going to make the audience hate that character. And I'm not really interested in characters being hateable. Even the worst antagonists, I want to know more about them. And I am not really interested in creating somebody who's that easy to write off. You know, there's not a lot of satisfaction in that, I don't think. So there were times when we had to sort of talk those things through. And like I said, you know, collaboration can be intense, and there were certain things I fought for. But what I always felt was people were listening, which I don't think is always the case. I think sometimes there's a real sense with authors to say, like, but don't you know this is a television show, not a book? And I think in this case, I never felt like I was sort of being dismissed or shunted aside. And look, I will not pretend that there aren't things in the show where I would have done them differently, but it's not my show, you know? And I think the greatest thing that has come out of this for me is, you know, this relationship, and not just with Eric, but with the writers, with the producers, with these actors, with these incredible production heads, is that it doesn't have to all be mine anymore.
Right.
It's okay. You know, like that trust is strong enough, and I'm so proud of what they did that sense of ego and ownership has sort of been disintegrated, and I kind of welcome that.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's a hard thing for anybody to do, it's something you created, and to let that go. So, I mean, I think it's definitely, like you said, it's important that you felt, you know, heard and listened to. So, and that kind of helps ease any kind of change or differences along. So, and then I wanted to ask also, I know Rule of Wolves recently landed on shelves. You called it a farewell to now for the Grishaverse. Is that pretty accurate? And what can fans expect next from you?
Well, I'm not saying I won't ever write in the Grishaverse again. I left some doors open, some big doors at the end of that book. And certainly there are a lot of stories that I would like to tell, but I needed to kind of take a step back and let the characters rest. You know, I put them through a lot. And I needed to, you know, things have gotten very noisy lately. And right. Let me be clear, I'm very grateful for all of it. I know how few authors ever get to have this opportunity. But it's different for me. I'm used to living a very solitary, isolated, in my little bubble life. And so I needed to just sort of take a step back and say that, you know, the Grishaverse is full of a lot of people right now, and it's okay for it to have its own life, and maybe I'll come back to it when I'm ready. But for what people can look forward to, I wrote a book called Ninth House. It is not suitable for children, so do not give it as a gift to your niece or nephew. But it is a dark fantasy set among the secret societies at Yale. And we're developing that over at Amazon. And I am working on the sequel, though I will admit I am running late. So not something any of you would be familiar with.
As a Game of Thrones site, we are familiar with running late. And I'm glad you brought up Ninth House, because I did want to ask about that. Is there any kind of update you can give us about that as far as the production? And more importantly, did you bring any lessons from Shadow and Bone over to Ninth House producing it for TV?
The big lesson was choose the right partner. And I can't yet talk about who I'm working with, but it was find the right partner, somebody you can trust and work with and have mutual respect with. I am more involved in this. I'm writing the pilot with this person, or actually at this point, rewriting it. And I feel grateful because this is sort of new territory for me. It's a very different kind of story. But I'm enjoying it a lot. The trick is to be able to keep writing novels while I do all of this TV stuff, because honestly, that is the thing I want to do most. I waited a long time. I didn't get my first book published until I was 37. So I waited a long time to have my dream job, and I don't want to lose it just because I can't keep up.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, that's basically all we have. Shadow and Bone debuts on Netflix April 23rd. Everybody tune in. And Leigh, thank you very much for the time. Hopefully we can speak again in the future.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me.